"You are finished," the CEO said. 5 years later, those 3 words would echo through a city she no longer controlled. The conference room overlooked downtown Dallas from the 32nd floor of Hale Industries headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a skyline built on ambition, competition, and money. The polished glass table reflected rows of executives sitting in expensive suits. Digital screens displayed quarterly reports. Coffee cups sat untouched beside neatly organized folders. Everything looked professional. Everything looked successful. Yet beneath the calm surface, tension filled the room. Wesley Grant sat near the far end of the table reviewing the same numbers everyone else had been studying for weeks. At 44 years old, he looked nothing like the executives surrounding him. His suit was older. His watch was inexpensive. His attention stayed fixed on the reports instead of the people. That was usually where he found answers. For 12 years, Wesley had quietly solved problems inside Hale Industries. He had rescued struggling projects, reorganized failing operations, found opportunities hidden inside overlooked assets. Yet most people barely noticed. He never took credit, never sought attention, never played office politics. He simply worked. Across the table sat Victoria Hale, 38 years old, brilliant, driven, CEO of the company founded by her family. Investors loved her. Business magazines praised her. Employees respected her. But success sometimes creates a dangerous illusion. It convinces people they can no longer be wrong. "We need to move forward," Victoria said. Her voice was confident and sharp. "The abandoned industrial property has become a liability." Several executives nodded immediately. The property sat outside Fort Worth. Hundreds of acres of neglected warehouses, rail connections, and manufacturing buildings. Maintenance costs continued rising. Taxes accumulated. Investors wanted it gone. Wesley looked up. "I disagree." The room became slightly quieter. Victoria folded her arms. "You disagree?" "Yes." He slid a report across the table. "The location still has value." One executive laughed softly. Another shook his head. They had heard this argument before. Wesley continued anyway. "The rail infrastructure alone makes it worth studying further." Victoria did not even glance at the report. "Nobody wants it. Not yet. We have spent 3 years trying to sell it. Because we are marketing it incorrectly." A few executives exchanged looks. Victoria leaned back in her chair. "Wesley, every consultant we hired reached the same conclusion. Then every consultant missed something." The room fell silent. Outside, clouds drifted across the Texas sky. Inside, the air conditioning hummed quietly overhead. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then Victoria smiled. Not warmly, politely. The way people smile before ending a conversation. "You always think there is another answer." Wesley met her gaze calmly. "Sometimes there is." Several executives shifted uncomfortably. The disagreement had moved beyond real estate. It had become something else. Vision, judgment, pride. Victoria stood and walked toward the windows overlooking the city. "We are selling the property." Wesley remained seated. "That is a mistake." Victoria turned. "No." Her voice carried across the room. "Keeping it was the mistake." The silence afterward felt heavy. Wesley looked down at the report one final time. The numbers still told the same story. Potential, opportunity, possibility. Yet nobody else seemed willing to see it. Victoria returned to the head of the table. "And frankly, Wesley, I think your judgment has become a liability." Several executives looked away immediately. The words landed harder than anyone expected. Wesley did not react. He simply listened. "You spend too much time chasing ideas nobody believes in. Some ideas need time. We do not have time." She placed a folder in front of him. "We have decided to move in a different direction." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Everyone understood what the folder meant. Wesley opened it slowly. Termination documents. Effective immediately. Across the room, several people seemed uncomfortable. Others looked relieved. Wesley studied the paperwork for several seconds. Then he signed it. No argument. No anger. No speech. Just acceptance. Victoria looked surprised. "That is it." Wesley closed the folder. "What else would you like me to do?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. Then it disappeared. "I think your career is over." The words hung in the room. Sharp. Final. Absolute. Wesley stood and gathered his things. Outside, the city continued moving beneath the afternoon sun. Inside, Every executive watched silently. Before leaving, Wesley paused near the door and glanced back toward the table. Not at Victoria, not at the executives. At the report nobody bothered to read. Then he walked away. 3 hours later, he sat at the kitchen table of a modest house outside Fort Worth while his 11-year-old daughter Ava finished homework nearby. The termination papers rested unopened beside him. "How was work?" she asked. Wesley smiled softly. "Interesting." Ava looked up. "That usually means bad." Wesley laughed quietly. Children often understood more than adults realized. He looked out the window toward the fading sunset. Somewhere beyond the horizon sat hundreds of acres of abandoned industrial land nobody wanted. A place everyone considered worthless. Everyone except him. The house was quiet after dinner. Ava sat at the kitchen table finishing a science project while Wesley Grant stared out the window at the fading Texas sunset. The termination papers remained folded beside him. He had not looked at them again. There was no point. The decision had already been made. What mattered now was what came next. "Are we going to be okay?" Ava asked suddenly. Wesley turned toward her. The question was simple. Honest. Children rarely complicated things the way adults did. "Yes." "You answered too fast." Wesley smiled. "That is because I already know." Ava studied him carefully. "You do not seem worried." "I am worried." "Then why are you smiling?" He looked out the window again. Somewhere beyond the distant horizon sat hundreds of acres of abandoned industrial property everyone considered worthless. The image had remained in his mind ever since leaving Hale Industries. Because sometimes problems look a lot like opportunities. Ava rolled her eyes. "That sounds like one of your business speeches." Wesley laughed quietly. "Maybe." The next morning began before sunrise. While most of Fort Worth still slept, Wesley drove west toward the abandoned property. His pickup truck bounced gently along cracked service roads lined with weeds and rusted fencing. The farther he traveled, the more forgotten the area seemed. Empty warehouses stretched across the landscape. Old rail tracks disappeared into overgrown fields. Broken signs leaned against chain-link fences. To most people, it looked like failure frozen in time. Wesley saw something different. He parked near a rusted gate and climbed out. The morning air felt cool. Silence covered the property. No workers. No traffic. No activity. Just hundreds of acres waiting for someone willing to look closer. Wesley spent hours walking through the site. He examined buildings, measured distances, studied rail access, reviewed utility connections. The condition looked rough. Very rough. Yet beneath the decay, something remained. Infrastructure. Potential. Location. Possibility. Every step reinforced the same conclusion. The property was not worthless. It was misunderstood. By noon, he sat on the hood of his truck reviewing old maps and notes. A familiar voice interrupted his concentration. "You actually came." Wesley looked up. A real estate broker stood nearby holding a folder. "I said I would." The broker laughed. "Most people do not bother." He handed over the paperwork. "You are the first serious buyer in almost 3 years." Wesley flipped through the documents. The asking price looked astonishingly low. Not because the property lacked value. Because nobody believed it had any. "Why is everyone avoiding it?" he asked. The broker shrugged. "Too big. Too expensive. Too complicated." Wesley nodded slowly. Complicated. He had spent most of his career solving complicated problems. Meanwhile, life inside Hale Industries continued moving forward. Or at least that was what everyone believed. Victoria Hale stood before investors discussing future growth initiatives, new acquisitions, expansion plans, efficiency targets. Nobody mentioned Wesley. Nobody discussed the abandoned property. As far as the company was concerned, both belonged to the past. During a board meeting that afternoon, one executive brought up the pending sale. "The industrial site should finally be off our books next month." Victoria barely looked up. "Good." The buyer seemed serious. Even better. The conversation ended there. Nobody asked who the buyer was. Nobody cared. Back at the property, Wesley continued exploring until sunset. By the time he returned home, his boots were covered in dust, and his notebook was filled with calculations. Ava immediately noticed. "You look happy." Wesley dropped into a kitchen chair. "Do I?" "Definitely." She pointed toward the notebook. "That usually means you found something." Wesley opened the notebook and turned it toward her. Rough sketches covered the pages. Building layouts, transportation routes, expansion concepts, future possibilities. Ava stared at the drawings. That is a lot. It is. Can we afford it? The question lingered. Wesley looked at the numbers one more time. Then he nodded. Barely. Ava's eyes widened. You are going to do it. Maybe. Dad. Probably. She laughed. You always say probably when you already decided. Wesley smiled. She knew him too well. Outside, darkness settled across the Texas countryside. Inside, father and daughter sat at the kitchen table studying plans for a place nobody wanted. A place everyone had abandoned. A place the CEO who fired him considered worthless. And for the first time since losing his job, Wesley felt something unexpected. Not relief. Not confidence. Vision. Because while everyone else saw the end of his career, he could already see the beginning of something entirely different. The purchase closed 32 days later. No reporters attended. No investors celebrated. No executives paid attention. The abandoned industrial property changed ownership on a quiet Thursday morning inside a small title office outside Fort Worth. A few signatures. A few documents. A handshake. Then it was done. Wesley Grant walked out carrying a folder and very little money. Most of his savings were gone. Years of careful planning had disappeared into a piece of land everyone else considered a mistake. The real estate broker followed him outside. You know, he said, shaking his head, I still think you are crazy. Wesley laughed softly. You are not the first person to mention that. Probably will not be the last. The broker looked toward the horizon where the abandoned warehouses sat beneath the Texas sky. Good luck. Wesley nodded. Thank you. He would need it. Back at home, Ava immediately knew the answer before he spoke. You bought it. Wesley smiled. Maybe. She pointed at the folder. Dad. Yes. You definitely bought it. He laughed. Yes. Ava threw both arms into the air. We own a city. Wesley nearly choked on his coffee. We absolutely do not own a city. A tiny city. Not even close. A very tiny city. Wesley shook his head. Children had a way of making impossible things sound reasonable. The following Monday, reality arrived. The property looked even worse when ownership officially became his responsibility. Broken pavement stretched between empty buildings. Rust-covered rail lines. Several structures needed repairs. Overgrown vegetation reached through cracked concrete. Standing in the middle of it all, Wesley understood why nobody wanted it. Every problem was visible. Every opportunity remained hidden. Most people stopped at what they could see. Wesley never had. He spent the next several weeks working alone. Every morning started before sunrise. Every evening ended after dark. He walked the property, studied maps, reviewed infrastructure records, contacted utility companies, researched transportation trends. While other people saw abandoned warehouses, he saw logistics corridors, manufacturing capacity, distribution potential, connections, possibilities. One afternoon, Ava climbed out of the pickup truck carrying sandwiches. You forgot lunch again. Wesley accepted the food and smiled. Thank you. She looked around at the enormous property. Do you ever get scared? The question surprised him. Sometimes. Really? Of course. Ava nodded thoughtfully. Good. Wesley laughed. Good. It would be weird if you were not. The answer stayed with him long after she returned to the truck. Meanwhile, life inside Hale Industries moved forward. Quarterly reports improved. New initiatives launched. Investors remained happy. Victoria Hale rarely thought about Wesley anymore. As far as she knew, he had disappeared. Occasionally, someone mentioned the abandoned property sale. Nobody seemed interested. One executive joked during a meeting. At least that problem belongs to someone else now. Laughter followed. Victoria smiled politely and continued discussing future acquisitions. The property was forgotten. Or so they believed. Summer arrived. Then autumn. Slowly, almost invisibly, small changes began appearing across the site. Utility access improved. Roads received repairs. Rail inspections were completed. Environmental reviews finished successfully. Local contractors started showing up. Truck traffic increased slightly. Nothing dramatic. Nothing newsworthy. Yet each change moved the property one step closer to becoming useful again. Several people in town noticed. Most remained skeptical. A few became curious. One local businessman stopped by the site one morning and watched construction crews clearing debris. What are you building? He asked. Wesley looked across the property. I am not building anything. The man frowned. Then why buy all this? Wesley smiled. Because somebody else will want to build something. The businessman stared at him. That sounds risky. It is. The man laughed and drove away. A few months later, another visitor arrived. Then another. Small manufacturers, distribution companies, logistics firms, people looking for affordable space connected to transportation networks. Most left after brief conversations. A few asked questions. One requested a second meeting. Wesley remained patient. He never rushed. He never pressured anyone. He simply waited for the right opportunity. One cold December morning, a black SUV stopped outside the property. A woman stepped out carrying a briefcase. She represented a regional manufacturing company searching for expansion space. Wesley spent 3 hours showing her around. Rail access, utility capacity, future growth potential. By the time she left, she seemed interested. Very interested. Ava noticed immediately. That one was different. Wesley nodded slowly. Maybe. Dad. Yes. You smiled. He looked toward the road where the SUV disappeared into the distance. Then back toward the endless acres everyone once called worthless. Maybe. But deep inside, he already knew. Because after months of preparation, planning, and patience, the first real opportunity had finally arrived. And if he was right, everything was about to change. The meeting took place 2 weeks later. Wesley arrived 30 minutes early. He always did. The winter air felt crisp as he parked beside the largest warehouse on the property. Frost still covered sections of the old rail tracks. The abandoned building stood quietly beneath a pale Texas sky. Yet for the first time since purchasing the land, the place no longer felt empty. Possibility hung in the air. The black SUV returned shortly after sunrise. This time it was not alone. 3 additional vehicles followed behind it. Executives stepped out carrying folders, tablets, and site plans. The woman from the manufacturing company approached first. Her name was Rachel Donovan. She shook Wesley's hand firmly. Good to see you again. Likewise. Rachel glanced around the property. My partners wanted to see it themselves. Wesley nodded. Fair enough. For the next several hours, he guided them through warehouses, utility corridors, transportation access points, and development plans. He answered every question patiently. Rail capacity, expansion options, energy infrastructure, future growth. The executives listened carefully. Unlike most visitors, they looked beyond the peeling paint and empty buildings. They were beginning to see what Wesley saw. By lunchtime, they stood inside one of the largest structures overlooking nearly 200 acres of unused land. Rachel turned toward her team. What do you think? The oldest executive smiled. I think we are looking at our next facility. Wesley remained quiet. Years of experience taught him not to celebrate too early. But Ava immediately noticed the change in his expression. She sat nearby, pretending to work on school assignments while secretly listening to everything. After the visitors left, she jumped to her feet. That was a yes. Wesley laughed. Maybe. Dad. Probably. Ava threw her hands into the air. You always do that. The official agreement arrived 10 days later. It was larger than Wesley expected. Much larger. The manufacturing company committed to a long-term development project that would bring hundreds of jobs to the area. Construction plans followed. Investment followed. Attention followed. Suddenly, the abandoned property nobody wanted became a destination. Local newspapers began publishing stories. Regional business journals took notice. County officials started visiting. Contractors filled parking lots. Survey crews appeared daily. Activity spread across the site like sunlight after a storm. Meanwhile, inside Hale Industries, Victoria Hale received a report she nearly ignored. During a routine meeting, one executive mentioned a development project outside Fort Worth. Interesting industrial redevelopment effort. Victoria barely looked up. Who owns it? The executive checked his notes. Someone named Wesley Grant. The room became silent. Victoria slowly lifted her eyes from the report in front of her. Excuse me. The executive looked confused. The former operations manager. Several people exchanged glances. Victoria extended her hand. Let me see that. She scanned the document quickly. Then again. Then more slowly. The numbers caught her attention immediately. Land value increases. Infrastructure investment. New business commitments. Employment projections. Every page made the situation harder to dismiss. How much property does he own? She asked. Almost all of it. Victoria leaned back in her chair. The abandoned industrial site she considered worthless was suddenly attracting serious interest. The realization irritated her more than she expected, not because Wesley was succeeding, because she remembered exactly what she said before firing him. "You are finished." The memory lingered uncomfortably. Back at the property, spring arrived. Construction crews moved equipment into place. Buildings received repairs. Roads expanded. Utility upgrades accelerated. What once looked abandoned now looked alive. Every week brought visible progress. Every month increased the value of the project. One afternoon, Ava stood on a small hill overlooking the site. Trucks moved across newly paved roads. Workers repaired warehouse roofs. Survey markers stretched toward the horizon. "It looks different." Wesley nodded. "It does. Do you remember when everyone said it was worthless?" Wesley smiled. "Most people only see what exists today." Ava looked across the growing development. "What do you see?" Wesley studied the property for a long moment. Then he answered honestly, "What it could become." The words stayed with her. Several days later, another article appeared. Then another. Reporters started calling. Business groups requested meetings. Investors wanted tours. The project was no longer a secret. It was becoming a success story. And somewhere inside Hale Industries headquarters, Victoria Hale continued reading every update she could find. Because the place she once sold without a second thought was transforming faster than anyone imagined. And with every new article, every new investment, and every new construction contract, one question became impossible to ignore. What if Wesley Grant had been right all along? The article appeared on a Monday morning. Then another appeared on Tuesday. By Friday, business publications across Texas were discussing the same story. A forgotten industrial property outside Fort Worth had become one of the fastest-growing redevelopment projects in the region. Investors wanted interviews. Economic analysts wanted numbers. Local officials wanted meetings. Everyone wanted to understand how something abandoned for years suddenly became valuable. The answer, of course, was not sudden at all. It was the result of months of planning and years of experience. But headlines rarely capture patience. Back at the property, Wesley Grant watched a convoy of construction vehicles enter through the newly renovated front gate. Fresh pavement replaced cracked roads. New signs stood where rusted markers once leaned. Warehouse roofs reflected sunlight instead of decay. Progress seemed visible everywhere. Yet Wesley remained focused on the next step rather than celebrating the current one. "You know," Ava said as she climbed out of the pickup truck, "normal people would take a day off." Wesley smiled. "Good thing I am not normal. That is becoming obvious." She handed him a folder. 3 more companies called this morning. Wesley glanced through the paperwork. Distribution, manufacturing, logistics. The interest continued growing. Every week brought new opportunities. Every opportunity created more jobs, more investment, more momentum. What once looked impossible now felt inevitable. Meanwhile, inside Hale Industries headquarters, the mood had become noticeably different. Victoria Hale sat in her office reviewing reports that made increasingly uncomfortable reading. Not because her company was failing. It was not. But every update about Wesley's project reminded her of something she preferred to forget. The property she sold. The opportunity she dismissed. The man she fired. One afternoon, during a leadership meeting, an executive casually mentioned the development again. The Grant Industrial Park project added another major tenant. Victoria looked up immediately. The room noticed. "How large?" she asked. "About 800 employees." The executive checked his notes. "Potentially more." Silence followed. Several people avoided eye contact. They all remembered the original property sale. They all remembered Wesley. Nobody said what they were thinking. Victoria did not need them to. She was already thinking it herself. Across the state, journalists began arriving regularly. Cameras appeared. Drone footage circulated online. Business magazines requested profiles. Wesley declined most interviews. The attention never interested him. The work did. One reporter finally convinced him to answer a few questions during a site visit. They stood near a renovated warehouse, while workers installed new equipment nearby. "What made you believe in this property?" the reporter asked. Wesley looked across the hundreds of acres stretching toward the horizon. Everyone kept asking what it was. And I was more interested in what it could become. The answer appeared in newspapers throughout the region the following week. It also appeared on Victoria Hale's desk. She read the article twice. Then a third time. Something about that sentence stayed with her. What it could become. The same argument Wesley made in the conference room before she fired him. The same argument she ignored. Late that evening, long after most employees left, Victoria stood alone in her office, staring through the city lights below. For years, she built a reputation on making difficult decisions quickly. Usually that confidence served her well. Yet confidence becomes dangerous when it leaves no room for humility. The realization was uncomfortable, necessary, and overdue. Back at the development site, another milestone arrived. The first completed facility officially opened. Hundreds of employees attended the ceremony. Local leaders gave speeches. Business owners shook hands. Families toured the new buildings. The atmosphere felt hopeful, alive, real. Ava stood beside her father watching people walk through spaces that sat empty only a year earlier. "Do you remember the first day?" she asked. Wesley nodded. "The weeds were taller than you." Ava laughed. "Everybody thought you were crazy. Some people still do." She smiled. "Not anymore." The ceremony continued throughout the afternoon. Reporters took photographs. Community leaders discussed future expansion. More announcements followed. More projects. More jobs. More growth. The abandoned property nobody wanted was rapidly becoming an economic center. Yet among all the visitors arriving that day, one unexpected name appeared on the guest list. Victoria Hale. Wesley noticed it while reviewing event schedules that evening. He stared at the page for several seconds. Then he looked toward the horizon where construction lights glowed beneath the darkening sky. After more than a year, the woman who declared his career finished was finally coming to see what he built. And for the first time since leaving Hale Industries, Wesley found himself wondering what he would say when she arrived. The invitation remained on Wesley Grant's desk for 3 days before Victoria Hale arrived. During that time, construction continued. New tenants signed agreements. Additional warehouses entered renovation. The project seemed to grow faster with every passing week. Yet despite everything happening around him, Wesley occasionally found himself thinking about the upcoming visit. Not because he was angry. The anger had disappeared long ago. Time has a way of replacing anger with perspective. What remained was curiosity. On a bright Thursday morning, black SUVs rolled through the front gate of the development. Workers noticed immediately. Office staff noticed. Ava noticed first. She stood beside the second-floor office window overlooking the entrance road. "She is here." Wesley looked up from a stack of site plans. "I know. Are you nervous?" He smiled. "A little." Ava nodded thoughtfully. "Good." Wesley laughed. "You sound exactly like me. That is probably your fault." Outside, Victoria stepped from the vehicle and paused. For several seconds, she simply looked around. The view before her barely resembled the abandoned property she remembered. Modern warehouses stretched across the horizon. Fresh roads connected active facilities. Freight trucks moved between loading areas. Construction crews worked on new buildings in the distance. Employees walked through spaces that once stood empty. Everywhere she looked, there was movement, purpose, growth. The transformation felt impossible, yet it was real. A project manager greeted her and offered a tour. Victoria accepted. During the next hour, she visited facilities, met business owners, and reviewed development plans. Every conversation revealed another layer of success. Hundreds of jobs had already been created. Additional companies were arriving. Local tax revenue had increased. The economic impact continued expanding. By the time the tour ended, she understood something difficult. Wesley had not simply bought property. He had built opportunity. Eventually, she found him standing near one of the newest warehouses reviewing construction schedules. The moment felt strangely familiar. Years earlier, they stood on opposite sides of a conference table discussing the same land. Back then, one saw value. The other saw liability. Victoria approached slowly. "You were right." Wesley looked up. No surprise. No triumph. Just calm recognition. "About what?" Victoria laughed softly. "Still doing that." "Doing what?" "Pretending you do not know exactly what I mean." Wesley smiled. "Maybe." They walked together along a paved road overlooking the development. The afternoon sun reflected from warehouse windows. Trucks moved in the distance. Employees crossed between buildings. The entire scene felt alive. "I spent months trying to understand how I missed it," Victoria admitted. Wesley listened quietly. "And?" She looked across the property. "I was looking at what existed." Wesley nodded. "Most people do." "You were looking at what could exist." Neither spoke for several seconds. The wind moved gently across the open land. Somewhere nearby, Construction equipment hummed steadily. Finally, Victoria stopped walking. I owe you more than an apology. Wesley looked at her. You do not owe me anything. That is not true. Her voice remained calm, but sincere. I told you your career was over. The memory lingered between them, clear as ever. Wesley glanced toward the horizon. People say things when they are frustrated. That is not an excuse. The answer surprised him, because it was exactly the kind of response Ava would give. Victoria continued. I was wrong about the property. She hesitated. And I was wrong about you. Wesley smiled faintly. That happens. Victoria shook her head. Not like this. For the first time, emotion appeared in her voice. Not dramatic emotion. Honest emotion. The kind that comes from confronting a mistake impossible to ignore. She reached into her bag and removed a document. Wesley immediately recognized the Hale Industries logo. What is this? A proposal? He did not take it. Victoria almost laughed. You have not even looked at it. I am not going back. I know. She handed him the document anyway. Read it. Wesley opened the folder. His expression changed immediately. This was not a job offer. Not a consulting contract. It was something else entirely. A proposal for a partnership between Hale Industries and the development project. A major one. Wesley looked up slowly. Victoria smiled. This time I would rather invest in your vision than argue against it. The words settled quietly into the afternoon air. Around them, the empire everyone said could never exist continued growing. And for the first time since the day she fired him, Victoria Hale was no longer standing opposite Wesley Grant. She was standing beside him. The proposal sat on Wesley Grant's desk for nearly a week before he signed it. Not because he doubted the opportunity, because he wanted to understand the intention behind it. For years, he had watched businesses chase short-term wins at the expense of long-term vision. The development project existed because he refused to do that. If Hale Industries became involved, the values had to align. Anything less would have been a mistake. One evening, after another long day of meetings and construction reviews, Wesley sat at the kitchen table, studying the final agreement, while Ava finished homework nearby. The house remained simple despite everything changing around them. Same furniture. Same walls. Same quiet rhythm. Success had transformed the property. It had not transformed them. You are staring at those papers again, Ava said without looking up. Wesley smiled. Maybe. That means yes. He laughed softly. You know me too well. Ava set down her pencil. Are you going to do it? Wesley looked through the window toward the fading Texas sunset. I think so. Good. That was quick. Because I already decided 3 days ago. Wesley shook his head. That sounds familiar. The following month brought changes nobody could ignore. The partnership attracted attention immediately. Investors noticed. Industry leaders noticed. Local governments noticed. New companies began contacting the development team almost daily. Distribution centers expanded. Manufacturing facilities multiplied. Employment numbers climbed. What started as a neglected industrial site was becoming something far larger than anyone predicted. Journalists eventually stopped calling it a redevelopment project. They started calling it an industrial corridor, then a regional hub, then something else entirely. An empire. The word made Wesley uncomfortable, yet he understood why people used it. The scale had become impossible to ignore. One afternoon, while reviewing new site plans, he received a message from Rachel Donovan. You should see this. Attached was a national business publication. The cover story featured the development project. Aerial photographs filled several pages. Newly constructed facilities stretched toward the horizon. Freight trains moved through renovated rail systems. Thousands of employees worked inside buildings that did not exist 2 years earlier. Wesley stared at the images quietly, not because he felt proud, because he remembered the weeds, the broken pavement, the silence. Across town, Victoria Hale received the same magazine. She sat alone in her office, turning pages slowly. Every photograph reminded her of that conference room meeting years earlier. The property sale, the argument, the dismissal. Most of all, she remembered one sentence. You are finished. The memory no longer embarrassed her. It educated her. Success teaches lessons. Failure teaches lessons. Humility teaches the most valuable ones. Later that week, Victoria visited the project again. No executives accompanied her this time. No meetings appeared on the schedule. She simply wanted to walk through the site and see it for herself. Workers greeted her politely. Business owners shared stories. Families discussed new opportunities. Everywhere she went, people spoke about growth, stability, hope. None of it happened by accident. Eventually, she found Wesley standing near a new logistics facility overlooking the property. The afternoon sun reflected from hundreds of windows across the development. Trucks moved along roads that did not exist when he purchased the land. Freight trains crossed tracks everyone once considered useless. The entire landscape seemed alive. Victoria joined him quietly. "I finally understand." Wesley looked over. "Understand what?" She gestured toward the horizon. "Why you fought so hard for this place." Wesley studied the view. Most people only saw what it was. Victoria nodded. "You saw what it could become." The words felt familiar now, true enough to repeat. They stood in comfortable silence for several moments. Not awkward silence. Respectful silence. The kind that arrives when explanations are no longer necessary. Finally, Victoria smiled. "You know what the funniest part is?" Wesley raised an eyebrow. "What?" "When I fired you, I thought I was protecting the company." Wesley laughed softly. "And?" Victoria looked across the development one more time. "Turns out I was handing away the best opportunity we ever had." Wesley did not answer immediately. Then he smiled. "That happens." Victoria laughed. "You always say that." "Because it is true." The wind moved gently through the open space between buildings. Somewhere in the distance, construction crews continued working on another expansion project. Another chapter. Another opportunity. Another reminder that vision often looks foolish until it succeeds. As the sun began sinking toward the horizon, Victoria realized something important. Wesley had not built this empire because he wanted revenge. He built it because he believed in something nobody else believed in. And that difference changed everything. 5 years after purchasing the property, the transformation was impossible to ignore. What began as a forgotten industrial site now stretched across thousands of acres of active development. Manufacturing plants operated around the clock. Distribution centers moved products across the country. Rail traffic flowed steadily through infrastructure everyone once considered obsolete. New roads connected facilities that did not exist when Wesley Grant first walked through the abandoned property, carrying a notebook and a vision. The project had become one of the most successful economic developments in Texas. More importantly, it had changed lives. One morning, Wesley stood on a platform overlooking the newest expansion site, while workers prepared for another groundbreaking ceremony. The air carried the sounds of construction equipment, freight trains, and conversation. None of those sounds existed here years earlier. Beside him stood Ava, now older, taller, and far more confident than the little girl who once sat at the kitchen table asking if they would be okay. "Do you remember the first day?" she asked. Wesley smiled. "You ask me that a lot." "Because I like the answer." He looked across the horizon. "Then yes, I remember." Ava pointed toward a massive facility under construction. "Nobody wanted this place." "That is true. Not one person." Wesley laughed softly. "Almost not one person." The answer made her smile. Across the state, business leaders now traveled to study the development. Universities used it as a case study. Economic journals wrote about vision, patience, and long-term thinking. Yet the part that interested Wesley most never appeared in the headlines. The jobs, the families, the opportunities, the people who built new futures because someone believed in a piece of land everyone else abandoned. One afternoon, a major business organization invited Wesley to receive an award recognizing his contribution to regional development. He almost declined. Ava refused to let him. "You are going." "I really do not need an award." That sounds exactly like someone who needs an award. The ceremony took place in Dallas. Hundreds of guests filled the ballroom. Executives, investors, community leaders, and journalists occupied tables beneath elegant lighting. Large screens displayed images of the development project from its earliest days through its current success. Wesley sat quietly near the front while people around him discussed numbers, investments, and expansion plans. None of that felt especially important. Then the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. The room gradually quieted. Awards were presented. Speeches were delivered. Applause echoed through the ballroom. Finally, the evening reached its final recognition. The screen behind the stage displayed an image of the abandoned property from years earlier. Broken pavement, empty warehouses, overgrown fields, a place nobody wanted. The next image showed the same location today. Thriving facilities, modern infrastructure, thousands of jobs. The contrast drew a visible reaction from the audience. Then the host spoke. Our final recipient saw opportunity where everyone else saw failure. The ballroom fell silent. Not polite silence. Genuine silence. The kind that appears when people understand the weight of a story. Wesley walked to the stage. He accepted the award. Cameras flashed. Applause filled the room. Then something unexpected happened. The host invited another guest to speak. Victoria Hale stepped onto the stage. Wesley looked genuinely surprised. The audience watched curiously. Victoria approached the podium and paused briefly. Then she smiled. Several years ago, I made one of the worst decisions of my career. The room grew even quieter. I fired a man because I thought his vision was unrealistic. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence deepened. Victoria looked toward Wesley. I told him he was finished. A few people exchanged glances. The story was becoming clear. Victoria continued. The truth is, he was just getting started. The ballroom remained completely silent for several seconds. Then applause erupted. Not for the award. Not for the success. For the honesty. For the recognition. For the lesson. Wesley stood there holding the award while hundreds of people applauded. Yet his attention drifted elsewhere. Toward Ava sitting near the front. She smiled proudly. The same way she smiled years ago when he purchased land nobody wanted. The same way she smiled when everyone thought he was making a mistake. The same way she smiled every time he chose belief over fear. Later that night, long after the ceremony ended, father and daughter stood outside beneath the Texas sky. City lights glowed in the distance. The award rested inside the truck. Neither of them seemed especially interested in it. So, Ava asked, what happens now? Wesley looked toward the horizon and smiled. The answer felt familiar. We keep building. And somewhere beyond the city lights stood an empire that existed because one single father refused to believe the end of his story had already been written. The award ended up sitting on a shelf in Wesley Grant's office, gathering dust faster than anyone expected. Visitors noticed it immediately. Journalists asked about it. Business leaders pointed toward it during meetings. Wesley rarely looked at it. The award represented recognition. What mattered to him was the work. 6 months after the ceremony, the development project continued expanding. New companies arrived. Existing facilities grew. Thousands of families now depended on opportunities that did not exist when the property sat abandoned behind rusted fences and broken pavement. Every morning, Wesley drove through the development before sunrise. It had become a habit. He liked seeing the lights come on. He liked watching freight trains arrive. He liked hearing the sounds of people building something meaningful together. One spring morning, Ava joined him. They parked on a hill overlooking the entire project. The view stretched for miles. Warehouses reflected the morning light. Trucks moved along carefully planned roads. Construction crews worked on another expansion site near the western edge of the property. Do you ever think about that meeting? Ava asked. Wesley smiled. Which one? The one where she fired you. He laughed softly. Sometimes. Ava looked across the landscape below. I think it worked out. I think you might be right. She nodded. Definitely right. The answer made him laugh again. A few weeks later, a regional economic summit invited Wesley and Victoria Hale to appear together on a discussion panel about leadership and development. The invitation felt unusual. Years earlier, they stood on opposite sides of a conference table. Now people wanted them to share a stage. The auditorium filled quickly. Executives, students, business owners, and community leaders occupied every seat. During the discussion, the moderator eventually asked the question everyone expected. What is the most important lesson each of you learned from this experience? Victoria answered first. She paused before speaking. Never assume you understand someone's potential because of their current circumstances. The audience nodded. Then the moderator turned toward Wesley. And you? Wesley looked across the room. For a moment, the audience became completely quiet. Most people spend too much time trying to prove other people wrong. He smiled gently. You accomplish far more by proving yourself right. The silence that followed felt powerful, not uncomfortable, meaningful. Several people wrote down the quote immediately. Others simply sat there thinking. After the event ended, Victoria and Wesley walked outside together. The evening sky glowed orange above the city. You know, Victoria said, I still remember exactly what I told you. Wesley nodded. I know. She shook her head. I wish I could take it back. Wesley stopped walking and looked toward the horizon. Then he smiled. I do not. Victoria looked surprised. Why? The answer came easily. Because if you never said it, I might never have bought the property. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Victoria laughed. A real laugh. The kind that arrives when the truth finally becomes impossible to deny. Years earlier, she believed she ended a career. In reality, she redirected a future. Much later that night, Wesley returned home. Ava sat at the kitchen table working on college applications. Seeing that made him pause. Time moved quickly. The little girl who once asked if they would be okay was preparing for her own future now. Dad, she asked. Yeah. Do you regret any of it? Wesley looked out the window toward the distant lights of the development glowing against the Texas night. He thought about losing his job. The uncertainty, the risk, the fear, the long days, the empty property, the people who doubted him. Then he thought about the families now employed there, the businesses thriving, the opportunities created, the life he built with Ava. Finally, he smiled. Not a single day. Outside, the lights continued shining across the empire nobody wanted. Inside, father and daughter sat together